You can read the entire Book of Esther from beginning to end, all 10 chapters, all 167 verses, and you will find something astonishingly missing. It is a detail so large that, once you notice it, it becomes the loudest thing on the page. The name of God is never mentioned, not once. There is no Yahweh, there is no Elohim, there is no Lord. No angels appear with messages from heaven. No prophets stand in the streets declaring the word of the Lord. No seas are parted, no fire falls from the sky. There is no covenant mentioned, no law given, and no voice speaking from a burning bush. For a book sitting right in the middle of the Hebrew scriptures, it feels entirely secular. For centuries, this absolute silence has made readers deeply uncomfortable. In the ancient world, it bothered some early readers so much that when the book was translated into Greek, they actually added extra chapters. They inserted long, desperate prayers for Esther and Mordecai. They wrote God's name into the text repeatedly, trying to make the story sound more religious, more traditional, more like the rest of the Bible. Even later in church history, figures like Martin Luther struggled with the book, wishing it did not exist because it felt too distant from the core of biblical theology. Most people assume that a Bible story must explicitly name God to be about God. They assume that if God is not speaking, he must be absent. They believe that divine activity always looks like a dramatic, unmistakable miracle. But the author of Esther is doing something brilliant. The complete absence of God's name is not an oversight. It is not an accident. It is a deliberate, highly sophisticated theological design. The author is writing to a group of exiled people who feel entirely abandoned. The Jewish people have been conquered. Jerusalem has fallen. The temple has been destroyed. They have been scattered across the vast and overwhelming Persian Empire. They are living under a foreign king, surrounded by foreign gods, in a culture that does not care about their history or their ancient covenant. In this deep exile, God seems completely silent. The age of the great prophets appears to be over. The spectacular miracles of the Exodus are a distant, fading memory. And so, the author writes a story that perfectly mirrors their reality. A story where God is invisible. The central discovery of the Book of Esther is this: the author has erased God's name to teach us how to recognize his hidden providence when he seems entirely quiet. The writer is training the reader's eyes. If you only look for God in the miraculous, the obvious, and the spectacular, you will conclude that he has abandoned the world. But if you learn how to look at the quiet pattern of events, you will see that his fingerprints are on every single page. History is not spinning out of control. It is being carefully, masterfully directed by a hand that refuses to show itself. The silence on the page is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, loaded silence. But to understand why the author intentionally hid God's name, and why the exiled people needed this exact message, we have to look at the chaotic world where this story actually takes place. We have to leave the holy city of Jerusalem behind and step into an empire where earthly power claims to be the only power that matters. To understand the silence of God in the Book of Esther, you first have to understand the deafening noise of the Persian Empire. The story opens in the capital city of Susa, under the reign of King Ahasuerus, known to history as Xerxes. He is not a minor, regional ruler. He commands an empire that stretches from India all the way to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. To the people living within it, Persia was not just an empire, it was the entire world. Esther chapter 1 begins with a feast. But this is not an ordinary banquet. The king throws a celebration that lasts for 180 days, half a year of unbroken feasting. This was a massive, strategic display of imperial dominance. Ahasuerus is gathering his military commanders, his princes, and his nobles to show them the blinding wealth of his kingdom. He is proving that his power is absolute and his resources are infinite. The author goes out of his way to give us an overwhelming list of details. We read about white cotton curtains tied with purple linen cords to silver rings. We see marble pillars. We are told about couches made of solid gold and silver, resting on mosaic pavements of porphyry, marble, and mother of pearl. Even the drinking vessels are made of gold, and no two cups are exactly alike. Why does the biblical text slow down to describe the interior decorating of a pagan palace? Because the author is painting a portrait of what earthly power actually looks like. Earthly power is loud. It is entirely visual. It constantly demands to be looked at. It builds massive structures and throws extravagant feasts to prove that it is in control. But beneath the gold and the marble, the author is carefully exposing something else. He is showing us that this loud, intimidating empire is actually incredibly fragile. On the final day of the feast, the king is drunk. He demands that Queen Vashti come before his intoxicated commanders, wearing her royal crown, simply so he can show off her beauty. It is a degrading command, and Vashti refuses. In a single moment, the illusion of total imperial control collapses. The man who rules the world is publicly humiliated by his own wife, and his reaction is almost comical. He throws a tantrum. He summons his highest advisors, the men who hold the empire together, and they panic. They conclude that if word gets out about the queen's refusal, every wife in the Persian Empire will rebel. The entire social order will unravel. So, they deploy the ultimate weapon of the Persian state. They issue an unalterable royal decree, a law of the Medes and Persians, which can never be revoked. Vashti is banished forever. The biblical writer is doing something brilliant here. He is exposing the terrifying absurdity of human power. King Ahasuerus can govern 127 provinces, but he cannot manage his own anger. He commands the strongest military on earth, but he is terrified of a domestic dispute. He has the power to issue permanent, unchangeable laws, but he writes them based on drunken pride and a bruised ego. This is the nightmare reality for the exiled Jewish people. They are living at the mercy of a massive, chaotic machine. They are ruled by a king who is completely unpredictable, who signs permanent decrees of life and death based on whoever is standing next to him. When you are a conquered minority living under that kind of power, God feels entirely absent. How can the invisible God of Israel compete with the blinding gold and deafening roar of Persia? The Book of Esther is about to show us that God does not compete in the noise. He does not shout over the ego of kings. He works underneath it. But to survive in a world this dangerous, the exiled people had to make difficult choices. They had to adapt. In many cases, they had to completely assimilate into the culture around them. In an empire this loud, survival often requires hiding who you really are. And that brings us to the two most compromised heroes in Scripture. If you read the Book of Esther, looking for flawless moral role models, you will be deeply disappointed. When we are introduced to the two heroes of the story, they do not look like the great prophets of Israel. They look like people who have entirely blended in. Even their names tell a story of cultural compromise. Mordecai is not a traditional Hebrew name. It is derived from Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. Esther is closely related to Ishtar, the pagan goddess of love and war. They belong to a Jewish family that chose to stay in the Persian Empire rather than return to Jerusalem when the exile officially ended. They are fully assimilated. In chapter 2, the king begins searching for a new queen to replace Vashti. This is often taught as a kind of ancient Cinderella story, a royal beauty pageant where an ordinary girl wins the heart of a powerful king. It is not a fairy tale. Young women are being taken from their homes by imperial decree. They are being placed into a royal harem, subjected to a system that strips them of their freedom, essentially making them the property of a volatile king. And when Esther is taken, Mordecai gives her a very specific instruction. He tells her to hide her Jewish identity. He commands her not to tell anyone who her people are or where she comes from, and she obeys. If you compare Esther to other biblical figures in exile, the contrast is jarring. Think of Daniel. When Daniel was taken to Babylon, he immediately refused the king's food because it violated the law of God. He prayed openly with his windows facing Jerusalem. He made his faith entirely visible, even when it threatened his life. Esther and Mordecai do the opposite. Esther goes into the king's palace. She eats the king's food. She undergoes 12 months of Persian beauty treatments. She conceals her heritage so completely that no one in the palace even suspects she is part of the Jewish exile. She vanishes into the system. For many early readers of Scripture, this was scandalous. Why would God use people who seem so disconnected from His covenant? Why would He build a story of national salvation around a woman who enters the harem of a pagan king and hides her true identity? But this is exactly where the brilliance of the book begins to reveal itself. The author is showing us that God's providence does not only operate through perfect people in holy places. His reach extends into the darkest, most compromised corners of human history. He is not only the God of the radiant saints, He is the God of the exiled, the fearful, and the hidden. Even when His people are living in compromise, even when they bear the names of foreign gods and disappear into a pagan empire, God has not abandoned them. He is silently moving pieces into place on a board that no one else can see. Mordecai's instruction to keep Esther's identity a secret seems like a quiet act of self-preservation. And perhaps it was. But that exact secret is the very thing that will eventually become the hinge of the entire story. God is taking the broken, compromised reality of assimilated exiles and weaving it into a masterclass of divine rescue. So far, Esther and Mordecai have successfully hidden who they are. They have blended into the background of Susa. But just as they disappear into the Persian system, an ancient, violent shadow from Israel's past steps back onto the stage. In chapter 3, a man named Haman rises to power. King Ahasuerus elevates him above all the other officials in the empire. He essentially becomes the second most powerful man in the known world. By royal command, everyone at the king's gate must bow down and pay homage to Haman as he passes. But Mordecai refuses. Day after day, the king's servants question him, but he will not kneel. When Haman realizes this, he is filled with rage. But notice what the text says. Haman thinks it is beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he decides to destroy all of Mordecai's people. He plots to wipe out the entire Jewish population throughout the whole kingdom. For many readers, this extreme reaction feels out of nowhere. Why does one man's refusal to bow escalate into an empire-wide genocide? To understand this, you have to look at the names. The biblical author rarely gives us a genealogy unless it is unlocking a door to the past. When Mordecai is first introduced in chapter 2, he is called the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. When Haman is introduced in chapter 3, he is given a very specific title. He is called Haman the Agagite. Those two ancestral names, Kish and Agag, carry centuries of blood between them. To find the origin of this conflict, you have to turn back the pages of Scripture to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 15, hundreds of years before the Persian Empire even existed. In that story, Israel's first king, King Saul, is sent into battle against a violent, predatory nation called the Amalekites. Saul's father was a man named Kish. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. The king of the Amalekites was a man named Agag. Saul wins the battle, but he directly disobeys God's command. He compromises. He spares King Agag and keeps the best of the plunder for himself. That single act of rebellion fractures his reign. The prophet Samuel confronts Saul, delivers the judgment of God, and the kingdom is torn away from Saul's family line. Now, bring that history back to the Persian palace. Hundreds of years later, in a foreign land, the descendant of Kish is standing face to face with the descendant of Agag. This is not a random workplace dispute. This is not a sudden clash of egos. This is the continuation of an ancient, unfinished war. Haman is an Amalekite. His hatred for the Jewish people is generational. When he sees Mordecai the Benjamite refusing to bow, it triggers a deep, historical rage. Haman does not just want to execute an insubordinate official. He wants to finish the war his ancestors started. He wants to wipe the people of the covenant off the face of the earth. So Haman goes to the king. He frames the Jewish people as a threat to the empire and offers a massive sum of silver to finance their slaughter. The king, distracted and careless, simply hands Haman his royal signet ring. He gives Haman the absolute power to write the decree. Haman consults his spiritual advisors to find the perfect day for the genocide. He rolls the pur, which is the ancient word for dice or lots. He is casting lots to let fate and the Persian gods decide the day the Jewish people will die. The dice land on the 13th day of the 12th month. The decree is written. The royal ring seals the document. The couriers ride out on fast horses to all 127 provinces. The text tells us that the city of Susa was thrown into confusion, while the king and Haman simply sat down to drink. The law of the Medes and Persians cannot be revoked. The trap is set. The timeline is locked. It seems like the pagan gods of chance have spoken, and the God of Israel is nowhere to be found. The decree of death is sealed. The law cannot be broken, and God is still entirely silent. But if you watch closely, the author is about to start dropping breadcrumbs. Haman has cast his dice. The exact date for the annihilation of the Jewish people is permanently set. The royal decree is moving across the empire on fast horses. It seems that fate and the Persian gods are entirely in control. But the biblical author has been quietly laying a foundation. If you look back over the first 4 chapters of the story, you start to notice something strange. A very specific, highly improbable architecture of coincidence is being built. First, out of all the young women taken from the 127 provinces, an assimilated Jewish orphan named Esther just happens to win the favor of the king's chief eunuch. Then, she just happens to win the heart of the unpredictable king. She is placed on the throne at the exact moment in history when her people will need someone on the inside. Second, at the exact time Esther is moving into the palace, her cousin Mordecai just happens to be sitting near the king's gate. 2 angry guards are plotting to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Mordecai just happens to overhear them. He sends word to Esther. Esther warns the king. The assassins are caught, and the event is recorded in the official royal chronicles. And then, surprisingly, Mordecai gets no reward. He is completely forgotten. In almost any other ancient story, that would be a flaw in the writing. Why introduce an assassination attempt if the hero gets nothing for stopping it? But in the Book of Esther, a delayed reward is not a forgotten detail. It is a loaded spring. God is quietly storing up a piece of information that will be deployed at the perfect second. When Haman's decree of death goes out, all of these random pieces suddenly collide. Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes. He sends a message to Esther, telling her she must go before the king and beg for the lives of her people. Esther is terrified. She reminds Mordecai of the law. Anyone who approaches the king uninvited is instantly put to death, unless the king extends his golden scepter. And Esther has not been called to see the king in 30 days. If she speaks, she will likely die. If she stays silent and keeps her identity hidden, she might just survive. Mordecai sends a final reply. And in this reply, we find the closest the book ever gets to naming God. He tells her, "If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish." Notice the careful wording. Mordecai does not say the name of the Lord. He says deliverance will rise from another place. He is completely confident that the covenant people of Israel will not be wiped out. He knows there is a hidden hand at work, an unseen loyalty keeping the world together. And then he asks the question that changes everything. "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai is telling her that the chaotic, compromised events of her life were never just blind luck. Her placement in the palace was not an accident. Her hidden identity was not a coincidence. It was providence. God is silently orchestrating the board, but Esther still has to choose to make the move. And she does. She stops hiding. She fasts for 3 days, and she sends back one of the most famous declarations in Scripture. "I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther plans a banquet. The tension is at its absolute highest. But all of these quiet coincidences, the foiled assassination, the forgotten reward, the sudden courage of a frightened queen, are building toward one exact night. A night that hinges entirely on a single, seemingly random case of insomnia. Esther invites King Ahasuerus and Haman to a private banquet. The tension is immense. The king is in a generous mood, offering to give Esther whatever she asks, up to half of his kingdom. This is her moment to expose Haman and beg for the lives of her people. But Esther hesitates. She does not plead for her life. Instead, she asks the king and Haman to return for a second banquet the following day. Why the delay? The biblical text does not tell us what Esther was thinking. Was she losing her nerve? Was she waiting for the king's mood to shift? We do not know. But we do know what that single night of delay accomplished. It created a precise 12-hour window for the turning point of the entire biblical narrative. Chapter 6 opens with a detail that seems entirely ordinary. King Ahasuerus could not sleep. In the grand sweep of a massive empire, a sleepless night is nothing. It is a mundane human frustration. But in the architecture of God's providence, it is everything. What do you do when you are an ancient king who cannot sleep? You ask for a book to be read to you. Ahasuerus asks his servants to bring the official chronicles of his reign. Out of years of royal records, out of thousands of pages of imperial history, the servants opened to one specific page. They read the exact record of Mordecai saving the king from a palace assassination. The king stops them. He asks what honor or dignity was given to Mordecai for this act of loyalty. The servants check the records and reply that nothing has been done. The reward had been forgotten. Now, pause and look at the timing. At that exact second, footsteps are heard in the outer court. It is Haman. But Haman is not there on official state business. He has just come from his own estate, where his ancient, generational hatred for Mordecai has reached a boiling point. He has just ordered his servants to build a gallows 75 feet high, specifically to execute Mordecai. Haman has come to the palace before dawn to ask the king for permission to hang him. The king calls Haman into the room. But before Haman can speak a single word about the gallows, the king asks him a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman's ego blinds him completely. He assumes the king is talking about him. So he paints a picture of absolute, breathtaking royal glory. Bring a royal robe the king has worn. Bring a horse the king has ridden. Put a royal crest on the horse's head. Have one of the most noble princes of the empire lead this man through the city square, shouting his praises for everyone to hear. It is a portrait of complete triumph. The king listens, nods, and delivers the most devastating command of Haman's life. Hurry! Take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. Haman, the man who drafted a continent-wide genocide, the man who built a towering gallows in his own backyard, is forced to walk through the streets of Susa. He has to lead the horse of his ancient enemy, loudly shouting his praises to the entire city. This is not just brilliant storytelling. This is profound theology. The author is showing us that God's sovereignty does not need to part a sea or drop fire from the sky to save his people. He can dismantle an empire-wide decree of death using nothing more than a king's insomnia, a dusty history book, and a man's own blinding pride. In a single morning, the entire balance of power flips. But the true theological weight of this moment goes far beyond Haman's humiliation in the city square. The great reversal has only just begun. Haman, leading Mordecai through the city square, is a stunning moment of poetic justice. But it is not the end of the story. It is simply the beginning of a massive, structural pattern that defines the entire second half of the book. It is the theology of reversal. In literary terms, a sudden, dramatic turning of the tables is a recognized plot device. But in the biblical narrative, it is much more than a clever literary trick. It is a profound statement about the nature of God's justice. The author of Esther wants us to see that when God moves against evil, he often takes the exact weapons the enemy forged and turns them back upon their maker. After the humiliating parade in the city square, Haman is rushed to Esther's second banquet. This is the moment Esther finally drops her disguise. She looks at the king and pleads for her life and the lives of her people. She reveals that her entire nation has been sold into destruction. The king is outraged. He demands to know who would dare do such a thing in his empire. And Esther points directly at the man sitting at the table. She calls him a foe and an enemy, the wicked Haman. The king storms out into the palace garden in a blind rage. Haman realizes his life is over. In a desperate panic, he throws himself onto the couch where Esther is reclining, begging her for mercy. But his timing, once again, is perfectly catastrophic. The king walks back into the room at that exact second. He sees Haman falling on the queen's couch and assumes Haman is trying to assault her inside the royal palace. The king's servants immediately cover Haman's face. His doom is sealed. One of the eunuchs then casually mentions a crucial piece of information. He points out that there is a 75-foot gallows standing at Haman's house. It was newly built, specifically designed for Mordecai, the very man whose loyalty had just saved the king's life. The king gives a brief, absolute command: hang him on it. The very structure Haman built to destroy the lineage of Israel becomes the instrument of his own execution. The ancient war between the descendant of Agag and the descendant of Kish ends with the enemy falling into his own trap. But the theological reversal does not stop with Haman. Haman is dead, but his law is still alive. The royal decree ordering the genocide of the Jewish people was sealed with the king's ring. In the Persian system, that means it can never be revoked. The 13th day of the 12th month is still a scheduled day of slaughter. Notice how God's providence operates here. It does not magically erase the law. Instead, it orchestrates a counter-move. The king gives his royal signet ring to Mordecai. Mordecai drafts a second decree. He grants the Jewish people the right to assemble, to arm themselves, and to strike back against anyone who tries to carry out the original order. When the 13th day of the 12th month finally arrives, the entire narrative flips. The day that was chosen by pagan dice for the annihilation of God's people becomes the exact day of their greatest victory. This is a quiet, powerful pattern you will find running through all of Scripture. David cuts off Goliath's head using Goliath's own sword. Pharaoh uses water to drown the infants of Israel, and God uses water to drown the chariots of Pharaoh. And centuries later, the ultimate reversal will occur when the empire uses a wooden cross to execute the Messiah, and God uses that exact cross to defeat death itself. The Book of Esther is teaching us that evil is ultimately self-destructive. It always builds the gallows for its own neck. The Jewish people are saved. The shadow of annihilation is completely lifted, and to ensure they never forget what happened in the darkness of exile, they create an annual festival. But the name they give this holiday contains the final secret of the entire book. The Jewish people do not just celebrate their survival, they institutionalize it. They create a feast. They establish a permanent holiday to ensure that generation after generation will remember the days when sorrow was turned into gladness and mourning into a festival. But the name they choose for this celebration is deeply unexpected. They call it Purim. To understand why that matters, we have to look at the root word. The word is pur. It is an ancient Persian word, and it means the lot, the dice. Remember back in chapter 3, when Haman was trying to find the perfect day to annihilate the Jewish people? He rolled the pur. He cast lots. He surrendered the timeline of his genocide to what he believed was fate, chance, and the pagan gods of the empire. So why would the Jewish people name their great festival of deliverance after the exact weapon of chance their enemy used to condemn them? Because that is the ultimate theological statement of the entire book. By naming the festival Purim, they are declaring that what the empire calls random chance, God calls providence. The dice were rolled in the presence of Haman, but the outcome was decided in the unseen courts of heaven. Haman thought he was dealing with blind fate. He had no idea he was dealing with the invisible God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this brings us all the way back to the silence on the very first page. Why is God's name never explicitly mentioned in the Book of Esther? Because the author is handing us a mirror. Most of us do not live our daily lives in the book of Exodus. We do not see seas parting. We do not hear voices speaking from burning bushes. We do not eat bread that falls miraculously from the sky every morning. Most of us live our lives in the Book of Esther. We live in a world that feels incredibly loud, chaotic, and completely out of control. We live in cultures where earthly power seems to hold all the cards. We face moments where history appears to be dictated by the random roll of the dice. We experience seasons of deep, agonizing silence, where it feels like God has completely abandoned the board. The Book of Esther was written to train our eyes for those exact moments. It is teaching us that just because God is not visible does not mean he is absent. Just because he is not speaking in a whirlwind does not mean he is not orchestrating the narrative. His providence does not require a spectacular miracle to accomplish his will. He can use the mundane insomnia of a pagan king. He can use a dusty, unread history book. He can use the compromised, hidden identity of an exiled orphan. He can take the absolute worst plans of the enemy and quietly bend them back upon themselves, turning a scheduled day of slaughter into a permanent festival of joy. The author erased the name of God from the text so that we would learn to find him in the shadows. When you know how to read the pattern, the silence is no longer terrifying. The silence is simply the workspace of providence. God does not have to be named to be entirely in control. The story of Esther was never just a historical record of a Persian political crisis. It was a theological map for anyone living in the tension of exile. It is the guarantee that the dice are thrown into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. The unseen hand was never absent. It was the quiet architecture holding the world together.